Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Cha Cha, and today I'm going to be going over memory, giving kind of brief overview of everything that you need to know for the MCAT. Once again, I am a student. One of my majors is psych, but that still doesn't mean that I won't make mistakes. So if I do make any mistakes, please let me know in the comments, and I tried my best not to. Um, So there's kind of like three different types of memory that you really need to know. So there's long-term memory, there's short-term memory, then there's working memory. So for long-term memory, there's like multiple different types. So there's like two subcategories. So there's explicit and there's implicit. So explicit is like the conscious memory. So like if you have to think about it, it is probably this type of memory. It's stored in your neocortex or like prefrontal cortex, and then episodic. Then there's two subcategories of the subcategory of explicit memory. So there's episodic and there's semantic. So episodic is like your autobiographical memory. So it's like episodes of your life, sort of like that's how I like to think about it. So it's like just like if you were to have like a picture book, right? So it's like different types, or it could be something as mundane. It's like what you had for breakfast that morning. Or maybe it's like when you went to the mall with your friends earlier that week. Or it can also be something like getting accepted into college or something like that. Like the big like memories of your life, I guess, milestones. Semantic is like factual memory. So it's stuff that like you know is to be true. So like for example, like when you look up like what color's the sky, it's blue. Or Biden was the 46th US president. So you don't really have an emotional attachment to this memory. It's just more or less things that you know about the world that are true. Then we have implicit or unconscious memory. So this is kind of like rote memorization. So it's automatic. Oh, and I forgot to say, oh wait, never mind. No, I did say that, sorry. Um, and then unlike the explicit memory, it's stored in the basal ganglia, which is something that you kind of often associate with like motion, which for this will make sense because the main type of implicit memory that you need to know is procedural. This is like knowing how to do things. That's how I like to think about it. It's like riding a bike or driving a car, just stuff that you could do now without even thinking about it. So like movement is often what this pertains to. And like typically like it's associated with the neurotransmitter dopamine. And then a fun fact about implicit memory. So it was discovered in the 1980s, which if you think about it, that's like a really long time to not know that there was an unconscious type of memory, especially like with Freud doing his thing, with his like in the 1920s and 30s. So I don't know. I always think that's like kind of interesting that it was like 50, 70 years, 60, sorry, not 70, 50 or 60 years later, that this was founded. Then there's also a different type of memory. So flashbulb, this is definitely considered like an episodic memory, but it's associated with like really strong emotions. So also, because it's associated with such strong emotions, we think that those emotions make our memory more concrete. So like if you have like a strong emotion, whether that be negative or positive, typically negative emotions, because we're always Debbie Downers, are remembered more strongly than positive emotions. But or we think, I should say, we remember them more strongly, but they are inaccurate a lot of the time. So just as inaccurate as like when there's no emotion associated with that memory. But the only difference is that we think they are. So that kind of makes them dangerous in a way because we just think that they're so infallible. So for example, like where were you on 9/11? A lot of people will say I exactly remember what I was doing. I was like in the like I was at work and then I saw on the TV like my boss turned on this news channel and we all together like with my coworkers like we saw 9/11 happen on TV. And then if you were to ask that person maybe like a couple years later what they were doing, maybe they would say, "Oh, I was at home and then my friend called me and said, 'Hey, watch the TV.'" So it's just like something like that. Usually like the base of it, like definitely like you did see 9/11 happen. There are some truths to it, but there's a lot of like the finer details that can change. Um, and then there's short-term memory and working memory. So short-term and working memory, they're pretty similar. The only difference really is like short-term memory is like a passive type of memory. Um, and then it uses the 7 ± 2 rule. So like that's typically like the capacity, so like how much information you could hold inside your like short-term memory at the same time. So like the max for someone who has like a really high working memory capacity would be 9. On the lower end, it would be 5, if that makes sense. So for example, it's like remembering like a phone number or something like that you're not actively changing would be a form of short-term memory. And then this only involves the hippocampus, and then I'll talk a little bit more about the hippocampus later. Whereas working memory, I like to think about it as like the application of short-term memory. So it still has that 7 ± 2 rule for its capacity, but it's like the manipulation of like your um selected information. So like for example, I like to think about it like if you're doing like a mental math problem like 58 plus 23, like 23, inside your head, like you see the numbers, which is like short-term memory. So like you're like holding it information in your head. So it's like 58, 23, 58, 23. Like you're rehearsing that inside your head. Like you're like repeating that information, but you're also changing it too. So like you're adding like 58 plus 23, so it's like 58 plus 20, 78. 78 plus 3, and then 81. And then so you're doing like multiple steps. And that involves the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, which the prefrontal cortex is also involved in long-term memory. So sometimes you have to pull information down in order to like fully understand what you're seeing. So it's kind of, I guess, like a bridge between short-term memory and long-term memory in a way. Um, and then so your hippocampus. So like just like the structure is like really important. Just like I'll go into like encoding, recall, sorry, retrieval, like storage in a little bit. It's part of the limbic system, so it also helps like ha create like short, not create, like transfer is a better word. Oh my God. Helps transfer like short-term memory to long-term memory. Um, So that's like really important, obviously. And then it's the only place in the body where neurogenesis occurs. After, I should say, like after birth. Like before birth, obviously, there's a lot of neurogenesis that's occurring. But after like infancy and birth, it's the only place where you could create new neurons, which is really important because like obviously you have like a lot of memories that are occurring. So that's the only place where neurogenesis can occur, which I feel like that's not going to be asked on the MCAT, but I just think it's like kind of cool. And it also illustrates just how important the hippocampus is in like memory formation and just like the brain in general. So there's like 3 different types of terms that are kind of like associated, I feel like, with memory. There's encoding, rehearsal, and retrieval. So encoding is like mentally filing in like information away, so it can be accessed for later. Like when you meet someone new, like you're trying to remember their name or their face, or like the facts that you're learning in this video. So you're trying to have that stored into long-term memory. So you're using your hippocampus, right? And your prefrontal cortex. Or hopefully it can get stored in your prefrontal cortex. Rehearsal is like a method that you can have information be encoded. So it's the conscious repetition of information and or keep it like fresh in our heads. So like if you're like, for example, maybe someone like hit your car and it's like you see their license plate. So you're like just like constantly just like repeating it so that you could remember it for later. Um, and then retrieval is like re-accessing that stored information. So there's like 2 different types of retrieval. So there's recognition, which is like when context brings forward your memories. Like for example, like when we're talking about like trying to encode someone's name, it's like, oh, like you see their face and then like, oh, I remember that person's name. That's like Jack, or like this is like Stacy. Or like for example, like if you're on a multiple choice test and then you see like you read a question, you're like, oh my God, I have no idea what the heck is happening. And then you see like some of the terms that are like one of the answers, like option C says I don't know, like for example, like encoding. And then you're like, oh, I totally know what that means because like it's like related to that question. Like maybe there was like some term in the question that like kind of like piqued your interest. Like maybe it said something about the hippocampus, um, for example. And then there's recall, which is like retrieving information without a context. So like in an essay, like maybe you're writing like a history essay, like there's like a I don't know if anyone took like AP World or anything, or Hog, but like maybe you have like a DBQ and it's like, oh, like I need to like remember like this specific amendment or like this specific event that happened in history, like it's like unprompted. Or maybe it's like if you're on a taking a chemistry exam but you don't have a periodic table, maybe you need to remember that carbon is like the sixth element, for example. So tricky, tricky, tricky. Um, then I kind of want to talk about like interference types. So as I kind of mentioned earlier with like flashbulb memories, like memory is not concrete, as like which is kind of trippy to think about. So like every time that you retrieve memory, you're actually changing that memory to fit that context that you're retrieving it in. Which kind of makes sense, like evolutionarily, and also because like we don't really have like a ton of space, despite like the hippocampus like constantly creating neurons, like we don't have an infinite amount of space. Like you're constantly like there's a concept called pruning, which pruning, here I'll write it down. Pruning is when like connections between your synapses are essentially getting like nerfed. So like they're getting like cut. So like if you have like two synapses but you're not really using them that often, you're gonna actually destroy that connection. So they're not gonna be there anymore. So that's what pruning is. And it makes sense that like basically like you don't have like you have a finite number. So that makes sense that like you're gonna have your memories change to be more accommodating. Um, there's like different types of like interference or just like memory like alterations, I guess is a better word for it. Um, well, I guess I wrote proactive interference twice. I was like looking at it, like, why is there not anything? But false memories are like memories for events that like never happened. I mean, they were suggested by someone or something. So kind of like lots of childhood memories, especially like memories that like occurred before the age of like 5. There's actually a word for this. It's called infantile amnesia. So like basically like maybe you like really have this vivid memory. For example, for me, right? Like I was around like 4 or 5 and I had like a Dora piñata. Like I was really obsessed with like Dora the Explorer. And then like my mom always tells a story where like my dog, my family dog, like jumped up on the table and then like accidentally like knocked Dora's cake over. And I remember like crying my eyes out and just like being so upset the rest of the day. But like there's no way I could have remembered that, even though it's such a vivid memory for me, just because like that's just like you can't really recall memories before the age of 5. So like I know that's impossible after like taking so many psychology classes. But like for me, that memory is just as strong. So like that's kind of a false memory. Or maybe another example of like a false memory is like when or I guess it's like, like the election being stolen, which I know maybe don't cancel me, I'm not MAGA or anything, but like people like if you like hear that the election got stolen enough, then maybe you're like, oh yeah, like that totally the election was stolen in 2020. And then retroactive interference. So like that's one new memory. So like kind of think retro old, right? So like think about it in the context of old memories. So like when new memories impact our ability to recall old memories. So like if you're learning a new language, let's say that you're trying to learn Spanish, but like your primary language is like English or your native language, I should say. So maybe like if you're trying to like say a sentence in English, like you accidentally use like a Spanish word instead. That'd be like a perfect example of retroactive interference. And then there's proactive interference, which is like when old memories impact our ability to recall new. So maybe after learning like a new phone number, like everyone kind of has that, like when you get a new phone number, a new address, where you accidentally put in your old, or maybe you combine the two. Um, and then there's familiarity, so it's kind of like a deja vu. So maybe like you think you may have encountered that stimulus before. There's this famous study with Jacoby. He did, I think it was in the 90s, but essentially like he had this whole thing where he had people look over a bunch of names, including like names of just like common people that weren't actually famous, or some famous and some that weren't famous. And then the next day, so 24 hours, he had them look at the list of names again. And then he combined the name like new names, normal names that like no one had ever heard of. And then he also had people look over like names that were famous, like Brad Pitt. And then he also had people look over like names that were in like common names that were in like the original list. So like let's say like Christina Smith was like in the first list of names, but she was also in that second day, even though that's a totally common name. As far as I know, no celebrity has that same name. So people are actually more likely to say Christina Smith was famous than just like a common name like the second time that they were asked to like rank, hey, is this person famous or not? So it's just kind of like that familiarity effect. Like that's like a very common example of this. Then there's a source monitoring error. So like that's when you believe that you learned a piece of information from a different source than you did. So like let's say for example you think, oh my gosh, what happened? Why did that get deleted? Okay. Um Oh, let's say like your doctor told you, you think that your doctor told you like that you don't have to drink that like you don't have to eat glucose or it's like bad for you. Like glucose is bad for you, like it makes you like fat or something, like your carbs make you fat. But it was actually like some TikTok influencer who is like trying to like push kombucha on you. Oh my God, why is this happening? That is not good. So like that's kind of an example of this happening. Oh no. Hold on. Of course. Give me 1 second. Mm, I hate OneNote. Okay, we're back. OneNote just doesn't seem to like me sometimes, so that's okay. Um, yeah, now essentially I want to go into like long-term potentiation or LTP. Also there's this like common thing like Hebbian law, Hebb's law, Hebbian. It's like neurons that fire together, wire together. Um, so essentially I kind of like I pulled this from like my something like that was in like one of my prior classes. So essentially, let's talk about LTV. So you have two different types of receptors that respond to glutamate, or like two main ones that are like really important. And also glutamate is like the main excitatory neurotransmitter inside of your body, which is like its antithesis or like its opposite is GABA, which is the main inhibitory, but there's also other types of inhibitory and excitatory neurotransmitters, but those are like the main ones. So AMPA is an ionotropic, so that means that it responds to or like it allows like sodium to go into your cell. So it doesn't necessarily have to be sodium, but it's like an ion channel. Um that responds to glutamate when glutamate binds to the receptor on the postsynaptic neuron, and then it produces an excitatory signal. And then this can activate the NMDA receptors. So what are NMDA receptors? So NMDA receptors, as I have here, there are two requirements in order for calcium, which is the ion that flows through NMDA to flow through NMDA. So there needs to be glutamate that binds to receptor, but also there needs to be an excitatory signal from AMPA. So there needs to be some depolarization that occurs. Otherwise, nothing will happen. Calcium will not flow through. So the NMDA receptor, so magnesium blocks it. And in order to dislodge that magnesium, that's why you need the excitatory signal. And then once that's open, it can trigger a signal cascade in which calcium channels, it basically goes in and then it basically increases, it changes the proteins in the synapse and some structure components, and it increases transcription for those AMPA receptors. So basically, it's just a positive feedback loop. And that just keeps going and going and going. Um, So essentially, it just like increases that bond that the presynaptic and postsynaptic neuron have, making it less susceptible to pruning and also making it just like overall just like a stronger connection, neural connection too. So it takes less like glutamate in order to like excite that neuron. Um, yeah, that's kind of all I have to say about that. Um, Okay, now let's kind of talk about like some memory tricks. So there's like a couple different like miscellaneous terms about memory that I kind of want to go over. So there's a schema, which is pretty important. So it's like mental categories, and then there may be some overlap between others. So I like kind of think about like schemas like mind maps or like associations. So like what words do you associate? So I have like restaurant in the middle, right? So like a restaurant you associate with food like maybe like Italian, Chinese, American food. And then a restaurant I usually associate with like waiters and hosts, like hostess is. And then some restaurants can be expensive. Usually, rest when you go out to eat, it's more expensive than if you were to cook at home. So I kind of associate that with like a sweet treat. And then most restaurants have some like background noise or chatter in the background. Um, and then some other thing is like chunking. So, it's like when you organize information into like more manageable units. So like for a phone number, you don't like just like think of it as like that whole thing. So it's not like so you wouldn't read it like 773 689 1231. For example, you'd go like 773 689 1231. Like there's like some spaces in between. Whereas for chunk, which makes it like more manageable to remember. Then there's like the method of loci. So like that's like method of like location. That's what loci means. So it's like you're literally creating like a mental map to retrieve that information. So maybe if you're a big back like myself, like maybe if you're like putting it inside your mind and you're like if maybe like oh like from my house there's like this really good like teriyaki place. It's like 2 blocks away. Like maybe you're at the grocery store and you're like trying to remember like what you need to get and you're like walking down the street and you go to a teriyaki place and you're like, oh yeah, that means that I need to get some chicken. And then if you walk like 1 block away, there's a Starbucks, so oh, I need to get coffee and just stuff like that. So it's like places that you like associate like with that items typically. And then there's also the pegword system. So pegword is like the numbers. So like you assign items to a number, pieces of information to a number. So like maybe like you associate one with like cheese, two with bread, et cetera, et cetera. So kind of like think about this like, oh, like at Jersey Mike's, for example, like they have like different numbers for like the sandwiches. It's just like sort of similar to that. Like different or like if you go to a restaurant, like a Chinese restaurant, like maybe like you get like combo number two, which is like curry and some like orange chicken or something like that. Um and then you have the primacy effect and the recency effect, which both of those combined make up the serial position effect. Wow. Okay, so for the primacy effect, I kind of think about this as like first impressions count. So you're more likely to remember, like if you have like items in a list, you're more likely to remember the first few items on said list. Whereas the recency effect, it's like fresh in your mind. So you're more likely to remember the last couple items on that list. And the serial position effect is a combination of the two, so you're more likely to remember the first and last items, not the middle items. They're kind of like the middle child, they're neglected. Um, and then you have the spacing effect. So this is essentially like don't cram, like gradually learn your information. So it's easier to relearn as you encounter the same information. Yeah, so essentially it's just like try and like gradually relearn that information. It's also kind of it's the same thing as like the saving effect, which is the same thing. Whereas like it takes less time to relearn that piece of information. So it like sticks in your brain like longer too. So it's usually like you can only remember like a small bit of information 30 days past when you initially learn it. So it's really important to like just like for the MCAT, for example, it's really important to like just like use like active recall methods. So like whether that be flashcards, um, maybe it's like drawing out like mind maps or however, just like some active recall method, or maybe like creating like tests or something. So it's really important to do that. I don't really have anything else to talk about. Hopefully that was like made some sense. Memory in general can be kind of difficult to talk about. It's like one, in my opinion, like it's like one of the more difficult psych topics to learn. But it's also like I feel like memory is like a high yield on the MCAT just because it's like so broad and it's so important. Yeah, hopefully that made sense. Once again, my name's Cha Cha. I am a student, so that means I am prone to mistakes. Hopefully I didn't make any, and hopefully that this video was helpful. And sorry my computer freeze in the middle of it. OneNote just doesn't seem to like me. Also, I think my computer is like gonna die, so that might be part of it. Um, yeah.